The boarding house kitchen in Broken Ridge was stifling on this particular summer afternoon in 1872, but 17-year-old Alara kept working, her substantial frame bent over the massive cast-iron stove as she prepared dinner for the 20 guests currently staying at Mrs. Blackwood's establishment. At nearly 400 pounds, Ilara had learned to ignore the constant ache in her feet, the way her dress clung to her sweat-soaked body, and the cruel comments that followed her everywhere she went. "Look at that fat cow," one of the cowboys lounging in the dining room said, his voice deliberately loud enough for Ilara to hear. "Can't believe Mrs. Blackwood keeps her on. Probably eats half the food she's supposed to be cooking." His companion laughed. "I heard her father tried to marry her off for years. Nobody would take her, not even with a dowry. Finally just abandoned her here and left town out of shame." Alara's hand shook as she stirred the stew, but she kept her eyes down and her mouth shut. She'd learned years ago that responding only made things worse. Mrs. Blackwood, the boarding house owner, kept her employed only because Alara worked for half the wages of a normal cook and could be housed in a tiny storage room rather than requiring proper quarters. It was exploitation, but it was survival. The afternoon stage pulled up outside with its usual clatter and dust. Ilara heard the commotion of new arrivals, but didn't look up. New guests just meant more work, more people to feed, more opportunities to be mocked. She was transferring the stew to serving bowls when a voice cut through the dining room chatter, deep and commanding in a way that made everyone fall silent. "Which one of you said that about the cook?" Ilara risked a glance through the kitchen doorway and saw a man unlike anyone she'd encountered in Broken Ridge. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with the kind of powerfully muscular build that came from years of hard physical labor. His broad shoulders, defined arms and chest, and the distinctive six-pack of abdominal muscles, visible even through his buckskin shirt, marked him as someone who lived by strength and skill. He had dark hair that touched his collar, a weathered face with intense green eyes, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived things most people couldn't imagine. "I asked a question," the man said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "Who made those comments about the woman working in the kitchen?" The cowboy who had spoken earlier stood up, trying to look brave despite the obvious size difference. "I did. What's it to you? She's just the cook." "She's a person," the man said coldly, "and you're talking about her like she's livestock. I don't tolerate that kind of cruelty." "You gonna do something about it, mountain man?" the cowboy challenged, his hand moving toward his gun. The stranger moved with shocking speed, closing the distance and disarming the cowboy before anyone could blink. He held the man's gun in one hand and the cowboy's wrist in the other, applying just enough pressure to make him wince. "I could do a lot of things about it," the stranger said quietly. "I could break your wrist. I could throw you through that window, or I could just make it very clear that anyone who speaks disrespectfully about that woman again will answer to me. Which option sounds best to you?" The third one," the cowboy gasped. The stranger released him and tossed his gun onto a table across the room. "Good choice. Now, apologize to the lady." "I'm sorry," the cowboy mumbled in Alara's direction. "Louder, and look at her when you say it." The cowboy turned to face the kitchen doorway where Alara stood frozen in shock. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I shouldn't have said those things. It was cruel and wrong." The stranger nodded and turned to address the entire dining room. "My name is Jax Stone. I'm a trapper and guide from the high country. I'll be staying here for a few days while I resupply. And I want to make something very clear. Anyone who disrespects that woman in the kitchen will have to deal with me. Are we understood?" A murmur of nervous agreement ran through the room. Jax walked to the kitchen doorway and looked at Ilara directly for the first time. "I apologize for the commotion, ma'am. May I ask your name?" "Ilara," she whispered, still stunned by what had just happened. "Ilara Winters." "Miss Winters?" Jax said with a slight nod. "I'm looking forward to trying your cooking. If it's half as good as it smells, we're all in for a treat." Over the next 3 days, Jax Stone's presence at the boarding house transformed Ilara's experience. People who had routinely mocked her now kept their mouths shut, clearly intimidated by the mountain man who had appointed himself her protector. Jax himself was unfailingly polite, complimenting her cooking genuinely and treating her with a respect she'd never experienced from anyone. On the third evening, as Ilara was cleaning up after dinner, Jax appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Miss Winters, may I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course," Ilara said, her heart racing. Up close, Jax was even more imposing, but she'd observed him carefully over the past days and had seen no cruelty in him, only a quiet strength and unexpected gentleness. "I've been thinking," Jax said, leaning against the doorframe. "You're clearly an excellent cook with a natural talent for it. But you're being exploited here, working for barely anything and living in conditions that aren't fit for an animal. I also couldn't help but notice that Mrs. Blackwood treats you terribly, and the guests follow her example." Ilara felt her face flush with shame. "I don't have many options, Mr. Stone. This is the only place that would employ me." "Because of your size," Jack said bluntly. "Yes," Ilara admitted quietly. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard," Jack said. "Your size has nothing to do with your worth or your capabilities. You're a skilled cook. You work harder than anyone else in this establishment, and you've got more dignity in your little finger than most of these people have in their whole bodies." He straightened up. "I'm heading back to my cabin in the mountains tomorrow. It's isolated, about 3 days' ride from here, but it's a good life. I make decent money trapping and guiding hunters. I could use someone to help manage the household cooking, preserving food, that kind of thing. Fair wages, your own room. Treated with respect. If you're interested." Ilara stared at him in shock. "You're offering me a job? Why would you do that for me?" "Because you deserve better than this," Jack said simply, "and because I've been living alone for 5 years and I'm tired of my own cooking. So it's mutually beneficial. But Miss Winters, I need you to understand this isn't charity. I'm offering you employment because I genuinely need help and you're genuinely qualified. What do you say?" Ilara's mind was racing. Leave Broken Ridge? Go to the mountains with this stranger? It was terrifying. But staying here, enduring endless mockery and exploitation, was its own kind of death. "Can I think about it?" "Take all the time you need," Jack said. "I'm leaving at dawn tomorrow. If you decide to come, meet me at the livery stable. If not, I'll respect your decision and wish you well." That night, Ilara barely slept. She thought about her life in Broken Ridge, the constant humiliation, the poverty, the hopelessness. She thought about her father, who had indeed tried to marry her off for years before finally abandoning her at the boarding house and disappearing. She thought about the stranger who had defended her without asking anything in return, who saw her as a person rather than a burden. By dawn, she'd made her decision. Jax was saddling his horse at the livery stable when Alara arrived, carrying the small bundle that contained all her worldly possessions. He looked at her, then at her bundle, and nodded with satisfaction. "Good choice," he said. "Let's get you a horse. Can you ride?" "Not really," Alara admitted. "We'll teach you," Jax said. "But for now, you can ride with me. It'll be slower going, but we'll manage." Mrs. Blackwood appeared as they were preparing to leave, her face red with fury. "Where do you think you're going, girl? You owe me 2 weeks' work." "I don't owe you anything," Alara said, finding courage she didn't know she had. "I've worked for you for 3 years at slave wages, living in a storage closet. You've made your money off me, Mrs. Blackwood. I'm done." "You can't just leave. I'll have the sheriff—" "The sheriff has no grounds to hold her," Jax interrupted. "She's not an indentured servant. She's an employee, and she's quitting. If you have a legal problem with that, take it up with the territorial courts." They rode out of Broken Ridge as the sun rose, leaving behind the only life Alara had ever known. The journey to Jax's cabin took 3 days, as he'd promised, and during that time, Alara learned more about her mysterious employer. Jax had been a soldier during the war, had seen terrible things, done terrible things. After it ended, he'd come west seeking solitude and peace. He'd been married briefly. His wife had died of fever their first winter in the mountains. He'd lived alone ever since, trapping and guiding and trying to find meaning in a life that felt increasingly empty. "I defended you in that boarding house, not just because it was the right thing to do," Jax admitted as they rode, "but because I recognized something of myself in you. The way people dismissed you, treated you as less than human, I've felt that too. After the war, people looked at me and saw only a killer. They couldn't see past what I'd done to who I was trying to become. I think you understand that kind of judgment." "I do," Alara said quietly. "People have always looked at me and seen only my size, never my skills, never my personality, never anything else about me, just fat. It's exhausting." "Well, I don't see you that way," Jax said. "I see someone who survived years of cruelty without becoming cruel herself. Someone who kept her dignity when everyone around her was trying to strip it away. That takes real strength, Alara, the kind of strength that matters." Jax's cabin appeared on the 3rd day, nestled in a protected valley with a clear stream, good hunting, and stunning mountain views. It was more substantial than Alara had expected, a solid 2-room structure with a loft, well-maintained and surprisingly comfortable. "Welcome home," Jax said, helping her down from the horse. "Your room is through that door. It's not fancy, but it's private, and it's yours. Take some time to settle in, and then we'll talk about how we want to organize the work around here." Over the following weeks, Alara discovered a capacity for happiness she'd forgotten existed. Jax treated her as a valued employee and, increasingly, as a friend. He taught her mountain skills, how to preserve meat, how to read weather signs, how to shoot his rifle. She taught him about cooking techniques and flavor combinations he'd never experienced. They fell into an easy partnership, each contributing skills that complemented the others. But it was during their mushroom foraging expeditions that their relationship truly deepened. Jax was an expert at identifying edible wild mushrooms, and he began teaching Alara this valuable skill. As they searched the forest floor together, they talked about everything, their pasts, their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. "Why did you really offer me that job?" Elara asked one day as they gathered chanterelles. The truth this time. Jax was quiet for a long moment. "Because when I saw you in that boarding house kitchen working so hard while people mocked you, I saw something I'd been missing for 5 years. Purpose. Someone who needed help and deserved it. A chance to do something good instead of just existing in isolation. You weren't just a skilled cook I could hire, Elara. You were a person I wanted to know, wanted to help, wanted to have in my life." He looked at her directly. "I've been alone so long because I convinced myself I didn't deserve connection, didn't deserve happiness after the things I did during the war. But you reminded me that people can survive terrible things and still be good, still be worth knowing. If you could survive years of abuse and still have kindness in your heart, maybe I could too." Elara felt tears streaming down her face. "You saved me, Jax. From that boarding house, from hopelessness, from believing I was as worthless as everyone said I was." "We saved each other," Jax corrected gently. "You saved me from isolation and self-punishment. I just gave you the space to become who you always had the potential to be." 6 months after Elara's arrival, their partnership evolved into something deeper. Jax began to realize he was falling in love with her, not despite her size, but simply as part of who she was, along with her intelligence, her humor, her strength, and her capacity for forgiveness. Elara found herself falling in love with Jax's gentleness, his respect, his ability to see her truly rather than through society's narrow lens. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jax spoke quietly. "Elara, I need to tell you something. When I brought you here, I told you it was an employment arrangement. That was true, but it's become so much more. You've become essential to me not as an employee, but as a partner, a friend, and more than that. I've fallen in love with you, completely, irrevocably in love, and I'm hoping you might feel the same." "I do," Elara whispered. "I love you too, Jax. I have for months. I just didn't dare to hope." "Hope," Jax said firmly, taking her hand. "Always hope, because I want to marry you, Elara. I want to make this partnership permanent. I want to build a life with you here in these mountains. What do you say?" "Yes," Elara said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I'll marry you." Their happiness was tested when 3 rough trappers arrived at the cabin one day while Jax was checking his trap lines. The men had heard about Jax's successful trapping territory and intended to claim it for themselves, willing to use violence if necessary. "Where's Stone?" the leader demanded when Elara opened the door. "He's not here," Elara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You need to leave." "We'll leave when we're good and ready," the man said, pushing past her into the cabin. "And when we leave, this territory will be ours. Stone can find somewhere else to trap." What the trappers didn't know was that Jax had spent months teaching Elara to shoot, and she'd proven to be an excellent marksman. When they started ransacking the cabin looking for Jax's maps and valuable furs, Elara calmly retrieved the rifle from its place above the fireplace and leveled it at the leader. "I asked you to leave," she said, her voice deadly calm. "Now I'm telling you, get out of my home, now." The trappers laughed, clearly not taking her seriously. "The fat girl's gonna shoot us? That's funny. Put down the gun before you hurt yourself." Ilara fired a warning shot that took the hat clean off the leader's head without touching him. The laughter died instantly. "The next one goes through your skull," Ilara said. "I'm an excellent shot, and I will defend my home and my fiancée. Leave now, or test whether I'm serious." The trappers fled just as Jax returned, drawn by the sound of gunfire. When Ilara explained what had happened, he looked at her with a mixture of concern and fierce pride. "You defended our home," he said. "You stood up to 3 armed men. Ilara, you're the bravest person I've ever known." "They threatened everything we've built," Ilara said simply. "I wasn't going to let them take it. This is my home, Jax, our home, and I'll fight for it." They married a month later, with a circuit preacher performing the ceremony and several of Jax's old trapper friends as witnesses. When Jax slipped the ring onto Ilara's finger and spoke his vows with conviction and love, she felt years of shame and worthlessness finally release their hold. The story of their courtship spread through the territory, often told around campfires and in saloons. "Nobody wanted to marry the fat girl," people would say, until the mountain man came and saw what everyone else had missed, that worth has nothing to do with size and everything to do with character. Years later, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset over the mountains they called home, Ilara thought about how far she'd come from that boarding house kitchen where she'd accepted mockery as normal. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Jax. "Defending me that day? Bringing me here?" "Never," Jax said, pulling her close. "Best decision I ever made. You brought life back to this cabin and to my heart. You're the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. I didn't rescue you that day, Ilara. We rescued each other."